Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. I want to do a quick update to my deck building toolbox series now that March of the Machine has come out. So the purpose of the deck building toolbox series is to offer you not just a crafting guide of cards, because I'm not an oracle. I can't predict what cards are going to be good in Standard. I can't tell you what the most powerful cards will be. What I have an eye for, and what I want you to develop an eye for, is recognizing the cards that you're interested in, and the cards that go in a wide variety of decks, things that will give you a toolbox of cards to build new decks with. Because when you spend your wild cards, I want you to get cards that go in the widest variety of decks possible, so you can get the most bang for your buck. That's the way that I want to spend my wild cards, and I don't want you to waste your wild cards on a deck that may or may not function. If you want to do that yourself, go ahead. Sometimes I do that. But for this series, we want to hone in on the cards that I think give you a wide variety of applications. So with that being said, I always like to start at colorless and lands, and in this case that's a tiny fragment of March of the Machine. There's not a lot of colorless to speak of, and the lands is going to be a real quick one. So, Urn of Godfire I don't think is really strong enough to see constructed play for the most part. If you like 6 and tap to blow something up, there is a card called Goblin Firebomb, I think it is. That's 7 and tap to destroy a permanent. It will even blow up lands. So if you like the removal aspect of this, that Goblin Firebomb, I think it has flash too. So I think you can play it as 1 at flash speed. Right, so at 8 mana at instant speed, you could blow up a land or any permanent, any at all. You don't get the color filtering that Urn of Godfire does, but as the uncommon land cycle from Homelands taught us, paying 2 to get color fixing is not that great. Not that great. Flywheel Racer, this is a solid card in Limited. As far as constructed, I think this would do fine, but I just don't immediately see for sure that this is what you want. It needs a creature in order to make mana. So, the decks that want this to fix their mana, I'm not so sure about. The decks that want this to be an aggressive creature, I'm not so sure about. It's okay, but I don't think you need to go out of your way to craft it. Kite Sail, this is pretty much limited playable. There's just stronger equipment options, even for the decks that want equipment in constructed. Halo Hopper is an interesting one. This has Convoke, which means that if you have 3 untapped creatures, you can just cast it at sorcery speed without paying any mana. Or, for example, if you had 2 untapped creatures and 1 mana, you could get a 3/2 for 1 in that case. I could imagine some aggressive decks. Maybe a tokens deck, but maybe not a tokens deck. Maybe just, a deck that takes a real aggressive line, floods onto the board quickly. Maybe there's a deck that wants Halo Hopper. Could be an artifact synergy deck too. There's the little 1/1 guy for 2 with Ward. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, he gets a +1 counter. Maybe there's a deck here. I think Halo Hopper is neat enough to consider crafting. Realm Breaker, this is legendary, so it's a big question of whether you would want more than 1. As far as 1 copy goes, it's Rampant Growth on a stick. If you haven't had the opportunity to play with Rampant Growth, it's a green sorcery for 2. Just finds you a basic land from your deck into play tapped. This one hits the opponent. Now you could whiff, right? The first time you activate this, you could whiff. And there's, I suppose, a dim possibility you could activate it twice and whiff twice and send 6 spells to their graveyard instead of any lands. That's possible. But for the typical deck, it's extremely likely you'll hit a land out of 3 cards. And after you've activated this a couple of times, it becomes increasingly likely you'll have milled more than 1 land at some point, which means that future activations of this just become more and more likely to keep hitting lands as you keep triggering it. And if you're ramping with this card, you know, paying 2 to net 1 mana for future turns is a really solid deal. You know, if there was a card that was like pay 2 and tap, make a Power Stone, I'm sure people would probably be using it already. A land is more useful than a Power Stone. I mean, not all the time, but mostly. Plus, you could mill out the opponent. It's not impossible. You could run this with like Jace and other things. The mill side of the card is not dead. Now, if pay 10 and tap and sack, you could get, you know, Praetor cards out of your deck, and some of the Praetors are very powerful. Shoulder It is removal right when she comes down. Elish Norn just changes all of the combat math on the battlefield immediately. It can kind of win the game from out of nowhere with an Alpha Strike using Elish Norn's ability. Because the opponent might not be able to pay to prevent all the life loss. You could even kill the opponent on blocks, which means they might not be able to attack you. And the other Praetors have their uses as well. You know, I like Vorinclex. He's just, you know, a big solid chunk of body, finds you some forests, doesn't take any special conditions to flip him other than mana. Could probably work pretty well with Realmbreaker. Anyway, I think 1 copy of Realmbreaker could definitely have some decks that want it. I'm not saying every deck's going to want it, but control decks like to hit their lands, and ramp decks really like to keep advancing their mana. I don't think it's out of the question that Realmbreaker could see play in a mid-rangey kind of deck too. So, yeah, I think 1 copy of Realmbreaker is well worth a craft. Skittering Surveyor, this is kind of a filler level card. This isn't terrible though. Right? You know, white has better options. There's like a 1/1 that can flip over into a lifelinker, it can find you a plains. So if you want to play like a chump blocker that finds you a land so you can depopulate, white's already got something. But maybe you want to use like the new black, you know, battle. Invasion of Fiora, I think it is. Where you can destroy all legends or all non-legends. If you just want a chump blocker that keeps hitting your land drops to get you closer to casting that, you know, there's probably better options than Skittering Surveyor, but you could do worse. It's not terrible. It hits up artifact synergies, hits creature synergies. It's something you wouldn't mind sacrificing in an Aristocrats deck. You know, something that comes in, gets you some kind of value, and then you could chump block with it, sacrifice it. I don't think this is like an unplayable card. I think you would need like just the right kind of deck that wants this effect. Wouldn't be terrible in a 3-4-5 color deck, right? Because you could have at least one of the basics of each of the basic colors that are in that deck. So 1 or 2 copies of Skittering Surveyor could help fix your mana. Probably not like 4 copies, but kind of similar to my comments on Ecologist Terrarium. I think Skittering Surveyor could have uses. Sword of Once and Future, I'm going to warn you that this could be a little bit of a trap. All the swords are playable, some more than others. Sword of Once and Future you know, once you manage to get it onto a creature, protection from blue and black is nice. +2/+2 is good, of course. Hitting Surveil 2 on combat damage is worthwhile. You might be able to get value out of your graveyard. You can cast an instant or sorcery with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. And that one I'm pretty uncertain of on this, because when you're building a deck, right, you put in this sword. Well, this is a lump of equipment, it needs creatures to go on. So now you need to put something in the deck that gives creatures that can equip this sword. But wait, you don't just need that, you also need enchantments and sorceries that cost 2 or less if you want to get that part of the sword. It's not the end of the world if the sword doesn't have a spell to copy, right? It's still like, you know, a chunk of decent benefit, protection from blue and black, get, you know, free surveils. That would still be okay. But you'd like to hit up all the parts of the sword, right? Use every piece of the buffalo. And that means you need several different card types to all go into the same deck, and that's a delicate balancing act. And it's not at all clear to me that this mythic card is going to be like an absolute shoe-in, something you'll use all the time. So I'm not going to tell you to run out and craft this. Invasion of Ravnica, though, I think this one's stellar. This is a battle, a siege. It's 5 colorless. It's a mythic, has 4 defense. When it ETBs, you exile a non-land permanent an opponent controls that is not exactly 2 colors. And that's pretty phenomenal. It is a restriction, that means there are some things this won't hit. But this can take out, for example, single color battles. It could take out another copy of itself. It can hit colorless things. It can take out artifacts. Can take out opposing enchantments. You know, monocolor planeswalkers. Can hit creatures, of course. Creatures is probably the most common one you're going to hit. Does not hit lands. When you flip this over, which takes, you know, 4 damage or removing the counters in some way, then you flip it over, you cast the Guildpact Paragon for free. It's a 5/5. And that, my friends, is already quite enough text to impress me. It's a removal spell that hits almost anything that turns into a 5/5. I am already content. But wait, there's more. If you happen to cast a spell that's exactly 2 colors, you can look at the top 6, reveal a card that's exactly 2 colors, put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom. That's flavor text to me. What I just read before all that, I was happy enough to start putting in green decks in other places. I don't care if I have no 2-color cards in the entire deck. I still think this is a playable card in a number of different archetypes, like Green Ramp. I mean, back when Strixhaven was legal, I actually ran Introduction to Annihilation in some decks, even not in the sideboard. Sometimes I actually ran it in the main deck, like in Ramp decks. Introduction to Annihilation didn't have a targeting restriction like this, but it also drew the opponent a card, which is a significant downside. And this one trades that downside for the potential upside of having a 5/5. I think this card is pretty phenomenal. Crafting one, sure. Crafting more than one, maybe. Maybe. You know, it depends on how much 5-drop removal you think you need in your deck. But it does have added upside attached to it. Craft one, for sure, easily. I'd be very tempted to craft more than one. And Phyrexian Archivist, this guy is playable and limited, Some people might not think so, but I'm going to tell you right now that he is. Be perfectly serviceable. As far as constructed, probably not. It's not that it's bad, it's just that there are better options. And if there are better options, then why would you use this one? That's the thing. So yeah, it's okay. It's a chunk of card. 4 or 5 reach is a significant body, but you just have better things to do in constructed. The putting cards from graveyards on the bottom of their owner's library, that could actually matter, but not enough to run it. So, all right, that hits up colorless here. I'll put my money where my mouth is. And go ahead and craft some of these up. Got some shiny new cards here. Alright, now let's talk about lands real quick. And I mean real quick. So the only new lands that are not basic lands, which you get for free, are this common cycle, right, of the 10 2-color pairs of the gain lands that come into play tapped and gain life. Those should look familiar to you, because on your new account, I believe you already have a playset of all of these cards. You might not necessarily have them from this set, but you might, depending on when you watch this video. And whether or not you have the playset from this set or not, as long as you've got a card that's been printed in Standard, all prior versions are legal to run. As long as it has the same name, it's the same card. So you don't need to craft these because you've already got them. Isn't that nice? Okay, some cards from White I wanted to highlight real quick. Elspeth's Might looks kind of neat. Does not always play well with everything in all situations. In particular, it does not look very good when the opponent has the Might active. You know the Might I'm talking about. Because they could attack with something and then protect it if you try to smite it. However, I think there are enough different aggro decks and places where Elspeth's Might probably will be useful. You can use it against a blocking creature as well. And the Exile's nice. I think 1 copy of this would be a pretty easy include in just about any white deck. It's a nice option. If it's not the right answer, then, you know, at least you only have 1 in your hand. Surge of Salvation's interesting. The 1-of copy seems okay for best of 1. More for the sideboard and best of 3. So you gain hexproof and your permanents. You prevent damage that black or red sources would deal. Now the opponent might not be black or red. The hexproof is kind of good enough. It can blank some spells and blank some effects. So I think having a 1-of in a best of 1 deck is probably a decent trick. I don't think you'll mind having it in the collection. Angelic Intervention, if you decide this is what you want in like a sort of a spells deck, you know, like a protect your creatures, grow them, like a blue-white or a red-white, you know, kind of spells deck. This is pretty good. Protection from any color or colorless plus a counter is nice. 2 mana's the part that's not ideal, but I think it's worth trying out. Sunder the Gateway, I think this card is amazing. I've already got 2 copies. I'm going to go ahead and craft a third here. Probably I would say going in for all 4 is good. Artifacts and enchantments, I mean, I know this only hits non-token ones, but artifacts and enchantments have been just ruling the roost. Just running roughshod over Standard for such a long time. It's up to the point now where people can just easily play 4 copies of Lauren and are happy to legend rule her in order to just keep getting the ETB trigger to blow things up. This when you destroy a non-token artifact or enchantment with it, it's kind of like a 2/2 for 4 that blew up something of the opponent's. But you got to pay the mana in installments, which is much nicer than having to pay it all up front. It's also a 2/2 for 4, which might be able to dodge a board sweeper because the incubator token's not a creature. There are ways that incubator tokens are sneakily kind of useful, kind of good. If you don't need it in that regard, it can still be a 2/2 for 2. Which, while not the best in Constructed, is like hardly unplayable if you've got an aggressive deck, and especially if you have, artifact synergies or +1 counter synergies, then you might be able to get more out of it than what appears on the surface. But I think that first mode on this card is going to come up all the time in Constructed, and that's what I think is making this so good here. Invasion of Dominaria, I mostly mention this one for the control decks out there, and especially the mono-white mid-range and mono-white control decks. They're already running effects that are kind of similar to this, and this one's got the upside of turning into an angel at some point. So those decks will probably want this card. Phyrexian Censor is a nasty card. Now, it could trip you up as well, but you can build your deck to break the symmetry to where it doesn't affect you quite as much. You also might be happy to play it in a deck where you don't mind everyone casting one spell a turn. I know we haven't seen a deck like that for a long time, but if you had a white-blue deck and you had a lot of counter spells, if you counter the opponent's one spell for the turn, then they're done. They can't do any more. If they try to do something at instant speed on your turn and you counter it, then they're done. I'm not saying that deck exists right now, but Phyrexian Censor, the effects on it are strong enough to brew around, to think about. Scroll Shift is a neat one. It's just a common. It's a neat one to think about brewing around and making things for and Constructed. There's the rare Angel, that's a 3/3. But I know the rare cards are more precious. If you have the rares to spare, that Angel could be really cool, but I wanted to call this one out as a common. That's instant speed. And it draws you a card that flickers things. So I think there's some neat play that Scroll Shift could have. Seal from Existence, this is one of the best Oblivion Rings I've ever seen. It costs double white, but that might not be a problem for you in Constructed. And it's got Ward 3, so it's really hard to muck with it for a large part of the game. This can just outright replace some of the existing removal that people have in their decks. What can I say? It's really good. Archangel Elspeth. If I didn't already have a copy of Elish Norn, I would be using my Mythic wildcard here to craft an Elish Norn, but I got one in my first draft. So, Elish Norn is legendary. I've got a rule where I usually don't go in for multiples of legends right off the bat. I respect that legendary is a drawback. So, you might be able to make better use of the slots in your deck by not legend ruling yourself. And Archangel Elspeth is a very serviceable looking planeswalker. She pluses to make lifelinking creatures. That's just good on its own. -2 to give a creature a permanent +2/+2 and flying. That's also very strong. She could do it twice in a row. If you're in an aggressive deck, that could just win the game on its own merits. And -6 to return all non-land permanents with mana value 3 or less. Obviously, if your deck can take advantage of that, that's great. Decks like Mono White Midrange, or even Control, they're full of enchantments and, things that get blown up. Invasion of Dominaria, for example, is yet another permanent that costs 3 or less that would gain you value if you pulled it back from the graveyard. And you can think of the others, there's like Restoration of Iganjo and Wedding Announcement and, Little Doggo that draws you a card, and the one that gets you a Plains, etc. The Ultimate's obviously good, but all the modes on the card are good. So, just because of that wide application, I think Archangel Elspeth's going to be worth your time. Elish Norn's ridiculous. Decent sized body, 3/5 vigilance for 4. This line of text about whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you or a permanent you control, that happens in combat. It happens when you block, it happens when they block, it happens just constantly. And if the opponent doesn't have a giant pile of mana available that they're using to the exclusion of casting their other spells, Elish Norn's going to deal a ton of damage to the opponent, or the threat of it will keep them from attacking or blocking the way that they want to. And then there's this whole thing where you could, flip her over into this enchantment that wins you the game. That's potentially there too. This card's ridiculously good. And Sunfall. I like Sunfall. 5 mana sorcery, exile all creatures. That's already just good right there. Then you incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way, so it comes with some value. I remember a card like this existed a while back, and made like an XX construct token, where X was the number of creatures destroyed. Don't remember the name of it, but exile is really strong. Getting the incubate token also is a very nice upside on this card. So, all in all, I really like this card. I think it's easily an inclusion that can go into your control decks. Very, very good. Good use of a rare. And to prove that I believe in what I say, finish the deck. There we go. Alright, talking about blue real quick here. I think Omen Hawker is going to be amazing at some point during its time in Standard. Could be very soon, could be a while. But in terms of being a deck builder, the way this card gets my brain ticking with different things to do with it. So, a lot of funky artifacts that I like have activated abilities on them. To name a few, there's, Reckoner Bankbuster, everyone knows that card is good. But there's Realmbreaker, that we just covered in Colorless. I look forward to activating it with the Omen Hawker. There's also Monument to Perfection from Phyrexia, All Will Be One. It's another way to ramp yourself, and another way to find game-ending threats with an artifact. Right, so Realmbreaker and Monument to Perfection both have like a front mode that gets you land, and a back mode which wins the game in some way. Omen Hawker can use them both effectively. I also don't see any reason they couldn't both be in the same deck, for what that's worth. Anyway, Omen Hawker is just neat. There's all kinds of things you can do with this card. Moment of Truth, this is just kind of fair. It's a fair 2-mana spell. Look at the top 3, one goes in your hand, one goes in your graveyard, which if you can get value out of the one that goes to the graveyard, then you've used every piece of the buffalo here, and one goes on the bottom of your library. So, just, reasonable spell. Chrome Host Seed Shark. It doesn't die to cut down. It's actually a decent blocker. And the incubators that it makes, they cost mana to flip over, but you can do that at instant speed, and they can block for you. I think this card might have some real play. I know it looks like a meme, but there's all kinds of different decks that this might go well into. You know, it could be like a blue-white deck where you want to like protect your creatures with little spells and make them gigantic. And Chromehost Seed Shark could let you go wide at the same time. Could just be some sort of a more control-y deck. Could be a tokens deck. You know, there's a lot of ways to try to start thinking about this card, and that's why I think it's a good card for the toolbox. Referee Squad. This card looks solid. You can convoke it, so it can be, you know, a better rate than a 2/2 Vigilance for 3. And when it ETBs, you tap a creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So this is a neat tempo play in a deck that wants creatures. So, you know, maybe a blue-white deck, maybe a blue-red deck, maybe even, dare I say it, a mono-blue tempo deck full of creatures. It's possible. Referee Squad's kind of neat. Sometimes you don't want to bounce the thing the opponent has. Sometimes they get too much value out of bouncing it. This can keep it in play, but keep it locked down. I think it's maybe all right. You're not going to find this card in booster packs, like for draft and such. This is one of the Jumpstart cards, but I think this one could be worth crafting. Meeting of Minds. This is one of the best draw 2s I've seen in quite a while. It's instant speed, and you can convoke it. So anytime you got 4 creatures, or some combination of, you know, 4 lands and or creatures, at the end of the opponent's turn, you can just draw 2 cards. In response to their board sweeper, you draw 2 cards. It seems very good to me. I think this could very easily be playable. And I think it's worthy of crafting. C double. This card looks amazing to me. There's any number of times where the opponent's doing something and you're like, man, that seems unfair. Well, how about you just do the same thing? They reanimate Atraxa. Well, you make your own Atraxa. There you go. They, you know, target you with something annoying like an Invoke Despair. Copy their Invoke Despair. Hit them right back with it. This spell seems like it's going to be really good, especially if March of the Machine affects the format and makes it a little bit more like big and swingy, and maybe we start to see the return of more like Reanimator decks and ramp decks and stuff. C double is going to punish decks like that and give you an incredible leg up into the game as the blue player. And this is the kind of card in blue that I love. I don't love counterspells that much, but copy effects and funky stuff like this, or you know, if you have like something that like, you know, turns creatures face down and makes them 2/2s, other weird stuff. The weird stuff that blue does is what I love about blue. This card, I think, is actually really good. And Invasion of Arcavios, I'm not going to tell you this is like the best battle, or the best blue rare or mythic, whatever, but from a deck building perspective, this opens up the sideboard in Best of 1. You've got a 7-card sideboard that you can access in Best of 1. And this lets you get a toolbox effect using the sideboard cards from outside the game. And you don't have to do it from just outside the game. You can look in your library and graveyard as well. So if you already got the card from out of your sideboard and you've only got the 1 copy and you want to get it again, you can pull it back from the graveyard. So yeah, I like cards that let you use the sideboard in Best of One. They're neat. And I think this one is going to do quite well. The way that I would probably use this personally, going into the sideboard, I'd want some one mana interaction removal spells. That way, if you have 6 mana, when you get the Invasion of Arcavios, you can play this down, immediately affect the board. You know, bounce something back to their hand, play a cut down, play a strangle. You get some 1 mana thing that changes what's happening on the board state. Have 2 or 3 of those lined up in your 7-card sideboard. The other things you want in your sideboard, maybe you could do 1 or 2 like 2 mana removal spells. And then if you have 7 mana, you can affect the board. But the other big thing that I want is a top end on my sideboard picks. Like Breach the Multiverse, the new black spell. That seems like a really strong sorcery, and I think it would be a cool thing to pull with Invasion of Arcavios. You know, grab it, untap on your next turn, maybe you can cast it. It seems like a really cool toolbox card to have here. Just, anytime there's some neat instants and sorceries in the format, especially big ones, then I think this card, its value starts to rise. So, yeah, I don't think it's the best, but I think it's alright. And then, if you manage to flip it, which takes 7 damage, it's a big investment, then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may copy it. Choose new targets for the copy. If all you wanted to do was just copy spells, the new Chandra would be easier for doing that. But the deck building of this card interests me. I think it's neat, and sometimes it's interesting to have a permanent like this that doesn't affect. You could flicker it, for example. So, I don't know if you should necessarily craft this card, but it's neat for the deck building toolbox, and I'm going to craft this card. Watch. Bam. Alright, so in black, Corrupted Conviction is like a new Village Rites. If there is going to be some kind of a sacrifice deck that exists in Standard, this will be a good card in it. It's definitely strong enough to be brewing around. Anytime you want to, pick up that archetype again and say, oh, I wonder if, a blue-black deck would do this, or I wonder if I could make a, Orzhov Aristocrats deck, whatever. You're going to want copies of this card when you're doing that. It's a good one for the toolbox. In the same vein, Dreg Recycler doesn't cost any mana, and it can also sacrifice artifacts. So, there's a chance that Dreg Recycler is something you could look at for, like the Oni Cold Anvil deck. And just that it doesn't cost any mana to do this effect is useful. It's a nice effect to have. Even when you're tapped out on your board, you could blank an opponent's removal spell, which might cause other effects of the spell to fizzle when they try to target your creature just by sacrificing it in response. It's a nice option to have. I don't know if it's worth a slot in your deck, but it's something to consider for the toolbox. In that same vein, Completed Huntmaster gives you real value on the board when you're sacrificing things. I'm a big fan of Geralf in blue. I think he's a really cool card. He has to sacrifice creatures, and they have to be non-tokens in order to make the flying zombies. This one doesn't care if they're tokens. You could be taking Decayed Zombies or anything with this guy and converting them into Incubate 3 tokens. I don't know if it might be too slow for Standard, but maybe with enough removal and other things to back it up, you could get onto the battlefield, start creating a presence, and as soon as you start activating these 3/3 incubators, That's going to give you the board presence you need against aggro. Again, I don't know if it's too slow. We'll see. But it's a neat one to have in the toolbox. Ichor Shade also could be good in, Oni Cold Anvil could be good in, Aristocrats, Sacrifice deck. It's going to grow over the course of the game, and you can build your deck in such a way to make it grow. It might not be good enough, but it's neat. It's something to think about. Render Inert, I'm almost sure there's some kind of funky tricks you could do with this card. You just remove counters from a permanent. Here's an example. There's a land, it comes in with one counter on it, you sacrifice it to blow up permanents with mana value equal to the number of counters on it. Normally, since it always starts with one counter, it can't hit tokens. But if you, for example, took the counters off of it with, like, Glissa, or now Render Inert, then you could sacrifice that land to blow up tokens. You can reset it. That's interesting. There have been various other cards in the past where it's like, oh wait, if you took all the counters off of it, this would suddenly be amazing. I'm not sure what we have in Standard, but this is a card to keep your eye on. You can also just flip battles for you, you can kill planeswalkers for you. If incubator tokens become a thing, deals with those. Or even just if you're up against like a green deck or something and they've got, like a big Dryad, whatever, it's got a whole bunch of +1 counters on it. You can just take the counters off, draw a card. It's not quite as good as a removal spell, but then again, it draws a card. I think you definitely want this for a deck where you are taking advantage of it. But then it can also have corner cases that come up once you've built that deck, where you can point it at the opponent as well. It's neat. Anything that comes in with a neat ETB trigger that might produce value is always interesting. So keep your eye on the Etch-Toast Doombringer. I'll give you one example here. You put out a battle, in this case we're going to go with Invasion of Zendikar in green. It comes down, it has 3 defense. You ramp up 2 lands. The next turn you untap. You definitely have 5 mana. You could play the Etch-Toast Doombringer, immediately flip that battle. That battle turns into a 4/4, it's like Vigilance, Haste, it can tap for mana. You might be able to double spell along with the Etch-Toast Doombringer. That might not be the best use of this card, and I'm sure you can think of better things to do when you untap with that much mana. Another interesting angle with this card is burning out the opponent, like damage to the face. Black burn decks do exist in the format. We've got Corrupt. We've got, Invoke Despair. Now, Invoke Despair is kind of taking the same spot in the deck that this might. But depending on how top-heavy your deck is and how much mana ramp you might have in your black deck, you could go big. You could have these as, some additional 5-drops on top of the Invoke Despairs, on top of the Corrupts. It's neat to do this kind of drain strategy where you've got creatures that do it. There's the Fox in the set too. It's like a 3/2 when it dies, it drains the opponent for 2. You can build this into a deck where you just kind of nickel and dime them to death, just with what's already built into the creatures. I don't think this one is maybe quite good enough, but it messes with battles, and that's interesting. So, it may not quite get there, but I think it's on the cusp. Something to keep your eye on. Invasion of Volgrotha, this is just an uncommon. It's not very efficient as removal, but it deals 3 to any target. It can hit another battle, it can hit a planeswalker, it can burn out your opponent's face. So again, if you want to do like a black life drain deck, this would be an option. And if you take the 5 counters off of this, it turns into Grandmother Singear. And she's not the worst. She's a 3/3 flyer, gains counters when your opponent's creatures die, gains you life in the process. Good incremental advantage on the backside. 3/3 flyer is also just a decent body in general. And that's on top of what it did on the front side. So, again, this may not quite get there, might not quite have the chops for constructed, but I feel like it's real close. Shoulder, it's good. Good use of your mythic. 4 or 5 menace for 5. Enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. So, they can't just toss away one of their humans from a wedding announcement, they have to get rid of something real. Something that they spent a card slot on in their deck. So, Shoulder, it's kind of a built-in 2-for-1. You take out something of the opponent's, and then, if they spend a removal spell on Shouldered, right, she got rid of 2 of their cards. Shouldered might also be able to flip over. She can only do this if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. This could happen naturally over the course of a game. It's also something you could make happen if you were interested. And on the flip side, she's just very powerful. Removal spell, discard 3, mill 3, and then put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control. That's ridiculous, obviously. And then you get Shouldered back, which makes them sacrifice a thing again. Yeah, this card's good. It's legendary, and it's 5-drop, so I don't know how many more you want to try to run, but I think crafting 1 is easy. Easy choice. Invasion of Fiora, if I didn't have a copy of this already, I would definitely craft one right now. So this is a sweeper, just a non-conditional mono-black sweeper. It's a nice tool that black has been missing ever since, Meathook Massacre got banned. So the front side is playable, right? 6-mana sweepers in black have been playable in Standard in the recent past. And has added value, right? For one thing, you might be able to do a one-sided sweeper a little bit by choosing between legendary or non-legendary. You can also just do both. And then it has added value on the backside, if you take the 4 counters off, of turning into Marchesa. 3/6 Menace Death Touch is already a pretty good stat line. And whenever she attacks, you remove all counters from a permanent, so she can just kill a planeswalker or just win a battle just immediately when she attacks. And if she lives to your next upkeep, if you haven't been dealt combat damage, you draw a card and lose a life. So she can even be a Phyrexian Arena. There's a ton of value built into this card and modality. I think it's great. I think it's a great use of a rare card. Just, since she's legendary on the flip side, just be wary of, flipping more than one. The front side is quite useful, though, and is not legendary on the front. So, I think it would be okay to run it in multiples. Phyrexian Gargantua, it's just an uncommon. Anytime you get, like, a decent-sized body that draws 2 cards, that's not bad. That's not bad. If your deck can afford to go a little later in the game, this is good value. And then if you can do things like regrow it from the graveyard or flicker it, etc., then you're going to get a ton of value out of this. There are probably better things you can do with rares and mythics and such, but on a budget, this is a really cool card. And it's small enough that you don't necessarily have to reanimate it or ramp up to it. You could naturally get to 6 mana over the course of a game. So it can go into a wider variety of decks, I feel like, than a 7 or 8 drop can. Yeah, pretty decent budget card. Maybe playable outside of budget. Something to think about. And Breach the Multiverse. I think this card is good. You just need impactful enough things to hit off of it. We're going to look at Italy in red eventually here. And Italy, I feel like, would be an incredible hit off of this, because not only do you get, right, Italy and something of the opponents when you breach the multiverse, then Italy triggers, and you get another thing of yours and the opponents. So you get, like, 2 of your permanents and 2 of the opponent's permanents all at the same time if you hit Italy off of a breach. There's other good things you could hit off of a breach as well. You know, there's like Titan of Industry puts out a ton of value when it hits the battlefield. Atraxa is really good. The only problem I have with Atraxa is she doesn't create as much of a stabilizing presence immediately. Right, she draws you a lot of cards, and if she lives, then the opponent can't really attack into her. But one removal spell gets rid of all of her effect on the battlefield. That's the thing I'm wary of with Atraxa. Still, she's good. I won't argue that she's a good card. There are other good cards too that are also worth hitting off of Breach. And I think it's well worthy of your time. Alright, so let's see. What have I got here? Yeah, I'm willing to spin those. Let's craft some cards. Alright, let's talk about red. Mirror and Bane Splitter is a common. This is a very solid chunk of equipment here. And I think it's not impossible it could have constructed applications. So, comes down for just 1 red, gives +2 power. I believe triggers Prowess. I think Prowess triggers for any spell that's not a creature. And moving it around for 3 mana, I mean, that might sound bad, but if you get to a stage of the game where you have some mana open, it's nice to have a mana sink that does something useful for you. You might not necessarily play it as a 4 of, but I think having 1 copy of this, or 1 or 2, especially since it can flash attach, seems pretty cool to me. Axeguard Artisan, this guy's neat. So whenever +1 counters are put on him the first time each turn, you make a treasure token. So you won't find this guy in booster packs. He comes from the Jumpstart. He probably won't make it in Standard unless there ends up being some kind of a deck or a combo. Right, people like the white card that draws you a card. This guy ramps you mana. Now, most people would probably say that cards are worth more than treasure, but there are times when the mana is more important than the cards are. And they could both be useful, possibly in the same deck. I guess I'm just saying there's some interesting play to this card. It could work with backup, it could work with, I like the soldier guy that puts counter on something every turn. Might be able to do something with green. There's the Ozolith, right, that puts counters on things. There are angles. There are things it might be able to do with this card. So just keep an eye on it. Invasion of Mercadia is pretty good. When it ETBs, you discard a card and then draw 2. So, similar to Brotherhood's End, you can't sacrifice this one to give creatures haste, but you can take 4 counters off of it to turn it into Chiron Flameright. So you get a 3/3, respectable body, and it can pay 3 and tap, discard a card, you get 2 elementals. Those are permanently there, right? That's not until end of turn. You just get 2 elementals when you discard a card. And creatures you control get +1/+0 and haste. It's a pretty good effect. Pretty good use for your lands, right? If you're into kind of a War of Attrition situation. Good way to use up your lands and deal some damage, be able to finish the opponent. And this card just being a permanent that gives you some kind of, value. This could easily slot into like Reanimator decks that want to put a card in their graveyard anyway. Stuff like that. I'm pretty certain this is going to see play. I feel pretty certain Invasion of Tarkir will see play as well. This is a mythic. It's 2 mana, it's battle, it's got 5 defense. When it ETBs, you can reveal dragons. It deals X+2 to any other target, where X is the number of cards you reveal that are dragons. So it does 2 damage as a baseline. Right, that's the floor. The floor is, it's 2 mana, 2 damage. If you flip it over, it turns into a Defiant Thundermaw. 4/4 Flying Trampler, whenever a dragon you control attacks, including itself, deals 2 damage to any target. So, the floor of this card is already decent. It's already fine. People have drawn comparisons to, oh, you know, Stupid Giant from Eldraine. Anyway, I wasn't playing quite as much right at that time, but Invasion of Tarkir looks eminently playable. If you happen to have a dragon in your hand, which you could even in an aggro deck. Aggro decks, there's the dragon for a red and X. It comes in with flying, haste, and X+1 counters. There's no reason you couldn't run this card in an aggro deck and that dragon in an aggro deck. So this could hit for 3 or more, even in a deck like that. But in a mid-range or like big red or ramp deck, there's also no reason it couldn't hit for more than 2 there as well. And even if it only hits for 2, it's fair basically. It's a fair removal spell that you can flip over and turn into a very nice creature. I think this is a very worthy use of a mythic wildcard. It'll go into all kinds of decks. Kinra Spell Spear. This is one to watch out for in spells decks, prowess decks. 2/2 Trample Prowess is already maybe playable for 2 mana, but then you can pay 3 or 4 and at sorcery speed, and it turns into a 3/3 Trample Ward 2 Prowess, which could end the game very easily. Rouse Reinforcements, this is just kind of like, this has been a playable card at various points in different standard formats. Makes token fodder. It's not amazing, but it's fair, and in some decks it's good. Volcanic Spite, this is going to be playable removal. Pretty decent. Can let you kind of cycle away a card to the bottom of your library and draw a new card. Ren's Resolve has already been seeing play under a different name in Standard, so this is sure to see some play as well. I wonder if both of them might be able to see play in the same deck. Curious about that. Invasion of Regatha. So this battle is interesting because it can pretty easily flip another battle. Right, like if you have Invasion of Mercadia, it's got 4 defense. Turn 3, Invasion of Regatha would just flip it over, because you can target a battle with it. You can also burn the opponent's face, which 4 damage for 3 is not the worst rate for burning the opponent's face. And it can deal 1 damage to a creature. You could do this post-combat to kill something that survived. You could also just take out, an X1. That's not bad. It's really not bad on the front side. If you have it in a deck where you want to flip battles, it's probably going to do some good work for you. On the back side, it's extremely dangerous. It's a 4/4 prowess, and if a non-creature source you control would deal damage to a creature, battle, or opponent, add +2. That's scary. Stoke the Flames, this is a reprint. It's a very playable card. Instant for 4, but it has Convoke, and deals 4 damage to any target. This is a very upgraded Lightning Blast, if anyone remembers that from back in the day. You'll probably find a point in Standard somewhere, some way that you play this card. Could be an aggro deck, could be a mid-range deck, could even maybe be a control deck, who knows. it's pretty decent. It can go face, it can hit planeswalkers, it can hit battles. Just useful. And Itali. So, there's also a Phoenix that's a rare. You might want to craft both of them. I'm leaning towards Itali here because I feel like this card is just good. And it's good in more than one style of deck. So it's a 7/7 Trampler. At ETBs, each player exiles cards until they exile a non-land, so you always hit a spell. You may cast any number of spells among the non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost, so you get one of your spells, one of the opponent's spells, you can cast them both for free. Plus, you got a 7/7 Trampler. This is likely to be phenomenal. Right? In your deck, if you're playing things like this, you're probably gonna hit, you know, some big creature or a ramp spell, something that's helping your strategy out. If you're able to run 7-mana spells in your deck, the hits for Itali are probably very good for you. It's a little bit more of a crapshoot for the opponent's card, but theoretically the opponent doesn't want to put bad cards in their deck. If it's something you don't want to play from the opponent, you can just leave it in exile. You know, like a Wrath of God, Farewell, something like that. You can just say, well, I'm not going to cast that. We'll just exile it. That's fine. But a lot of the time, you know, you're going to hit like a Sholdred or a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or a removal spell that kills one of their creatures, Invoke Despair. You're going to hit something of the opponent's very often that they do not want you to cast. And you can ramp into Itali. You could maybe try it as like the Finial, you know, like the jewel at the top of your scepter. In a normal deck, right, where you have like 1 or 2 6-drops, this has your only 7-drop. Go a little bit bigger than normal. You could try to get there that way. You can ramp to Itali. That would be more functional. You can reanimate Itali from out of the graveyard. That'd be functional. You could try to get him into play some other way, like Breach the Multiverse. That would be functional too. Oh yeah, and there's this whole thing where you can like transform him and he like poisons the opponent out like a Blightsteel Colossus. Whatever. The front side is really the thing with this card. The back side is all gravy. If you do that, kudos. The card's good enough on the front side. Alright. Let's craft them. Put my money where my mouth is. Alright, getting into green here. Atrax's Fall is an interesting tool in the toolbox. It destroys 4 different types of permanents, with the restriction that the creatures have to fly. But artifacts, enchantments, and battles. I believe this is one of the few cards, other than something that destroys a non-land permanent, that specifically destroys a battle. So, take that for what you will. It's a common. If you decide that your deck might need it, you can go ahead and run it. Standard is rife with artifacts and enchantments. You'll probably find some targets for this. Cosmic Hunger is a new and improved, you know, not a fight spell, but damage equal to power spell. It's an instant. It's 2 mana, so it's like a couple other options that we have in Standard. But it can also hit battles, so it's upgraded. Herbology Instructor is just like a decent little guy to get down to block early. Gains you 3 life, so if you have a life gain strategy, could be useful. I can flip him over later for value. He might not get there in Constructed. But depending on what your deck is trying to do, you might find some synergies. Ozolith, I think, is actually quite good. Now, it's legendary, so you can't get more than 1 in play. It has cycling to make up for it, though. So you can cycle away extra copies if you had more than one. And the thing that's cool about Ozolith is that it plays well enough on its own. Right? On turn 4, you can play out the Ozolith, activate it at sorcery speed, put 2 +1 counters on a creature, you've affected the board. And that's nice. Even with no other +1 counter theme in your deck, the card is affecting the board and doing things. And it goes into a wide variety of decks, I think, because of that. A lot of decks can make use of Ozolith. Now, whether it's the best use of your slot, that's up to you, but I think this card is very strong. Streetwise Negotiator. This is a fantastic option for a budget aggro deck. This is a 3/3 for 3. To put the counter on itself, has 3 toughness, assigns damage with 3 toughness. Unfortunately dies to cut down, but you can't not run aggro creatures just because they die to cut down. The idea is you flood the board with so many of them that a cut down doesn't quite do it. And this can also give away its counter. So in that regard, it can have like a point of haste, right? Where it makes another creature harder to deal with and get in immediately that turn. Could even give more surprise damage if it happened to have higher toughness than power for some reason. Overall, this is just a really solid card. It doesn't read like it when you first look at it, but the more you think about it, you realize it's like a 3/3 for 2, and that's great. It's just an uncommon. Overgrown Pest might actually be able to see play in Standard. It's kind of right on the cusp, sort of like the Vorak was in Phyrexia All Will Be One. You can maybe play the Vorak in a Standard deck. It's maybe good enough, especially if you can use the Proliferate. For the Pest, I would say it's maybe playable, especially if you can pull up double face cards with it. Like imagine a green-black deck. You're running 4 Invasion of Fiora. It's your board sweeper of choice. The Pest can either ramp you towards it, or it can find the invasion for you and put it in your hand. Now you've got a chump blocker, or something the opponent has to waste like spot removal on, and it's digging you closer into your overall game plan. I can imagine constructed decks that would actually maybe want this card, so don't count it out. Converter Beast doesn't look that great, but you could flicker it. You could pull it back from the graveyard for added value. It's strange. It kind of plays well in a deck that has board sweepers in it, right? Because you could play this down, you've got a chump blocker now, you chump it away, it dies, you play a board sweeper, the incubator token survives the board sweeper. Now you have this 5/5, maybe, even with kind of like surprise haste, like you activate it on the opponent's turn, or you activate it, and now it's already been in play, so it can attack. It can't attack the turn it comes into play, but it's sneaky. I think there's maybe more than one style of deck that could make a Converter Beast of use. It's probably not the best use of a card slot in your deck, I'm not going to tell you that, but it could be an interesting budget option. It's probably not better than other rare and mythic cards in Standard, but it might be more playable than it looks. Invasion of Zendikar, I've always loved ramp 2 for 4 effects. They're just great. Explosive Vegetation is the one a lot of people compare it to. I remember one from Nemesis that was, sometimes even better than that. Like, it was 4 mana sorcery, and you get 2 forests, and they enter the battlefield untapped. That one was great. Sometimes you could make use of that extra mana right away, but in this case, the added value that you get on top of an Explosive Vegetation is this permanent. You know, a permanent could be useful in various ways, but if you take the counters off of it, you get a 4/4 Vigilance Haste. It's a land, so anything that deals with non-land permanents doesn't hit this because it's a land. And it taps to add 1 mana of any color. So it ramps you again, gives you a very relevant body on the battlefield. I feel like for a ramp deck, this is a fantastic card. Now, I'm not sure how much you want it outside of a ramp deck. Maybe you want it in, you know, like a 3/4/5 color deck that's using green as a base, using green fixing. Or, you know, maybe you're just running a copy or 2 of it in a mid-range deck just to get some value. Like, you're not trying to get to 8 or 9 mana, but it would be nice to hit 6, perhaps. I think this card could do some really good work. Ravenous Sailback. So this might be even better in Constructed than it is in Limited. I know it doesn't look that great. But then again, neither did Lauren of the Third Path when people first saw her. ETB, Destroy an Artifact or Enchantment, is incredibly relevant in Standard. The format could change, but if it does, then this will still be a neat tool to have in the toolbox. It can also come down with haste. And, for example, that could help you to flip a battle or kill a planeswalker when the opponent's not expecting an attack immediately. Right? It changes up the pace of the game. And it's you know, it's something at the 5-drop that does this. So various tutor effects, like the 3-mana sorcery that finds creatures of different powers. This is a neat one to be able to fetch out like a toolbox deck. Or if you're running the Green Vivian, you know, you can go from a 4-drop into a 5-drop, pull this straight out, blow up an artifact or enchantment immediately. It's a neat option there as well. And I think just playing it on its own, just on the merit of blowing up your opponent's artifacts and enchantments, is gonna see enough targets to be playable in Standard. It sounds crazy for a 3/4 for 5, but if it's always doing that Necrotal effect when it comes in, or almost always, then I think it's probably playable. And we got Vorinclex. Vorinclex is legendary, so I'm not going to tell you to go out and craft like 4 of them. It's a mythic. But you get a 6/6 trample reach for 5, which is just a fantastic body on the battlefield. The reach is very relevant. The trample helps to close out the game. When it ETBs, you get 2 forests, which don't have to be basics. Right, so you can get your Streets of New Capenna tri-lands. You can cycle them for value. Reveal and put them in your hand, shuffle. And if you happen to own Vorinclex but you were building a budget deck, you could use the new Dominaria, a little common lands, right? That intertapped and make 2 colors and they have 2 land types. If for some reason, if you were making a budget deck but you happen to own Vorinclex and you were making that budget deck, then he would be good for that. He could fetch those duels out as well. And then on top of all that value, right, a big relevant body on the battlefield draws you 2 forests that don't have to be basics. Then you can pay 8 with no, he doesn't have any other, you know, clauses in this. All the other Praetors require something before they can do it. He just requires mana. 8 as a sorcery, flips over, turns into the Grand Evolution. You mill 10 cards, you can get 2 creatures from among those on the battlefield. So you want a pretty good density of creatures in the deck. It's not a big ask, though. Chapter 2, put 7 +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures you control. That's also very powerful. Those 2 chapters might have won you the game. And then Chapter 3, your creatures gain 1 colorless. This creature fights target creature you don't control. And you get Vorinclex back. Now he doesn't gain his own fight ability because he wasn't on the battlefield, right, when the last chapter of the Grand Evolution went off. But you get him back. And you get 2 more forests. I think just based on the value of the front side that Vorinclex is worth it. I think he's worth playing. I think he's going to be great for ramp decks. Alright. I'm definitely willing to craft this batch of cards up. Alright. Marshal of Zulfir. This is an uncommon. This is a Night Deck Lord. Now there's not much to say here. If you want to try to build the Night Deck, then obviously you're going to want to craft 4 of these. And if the Night Deck doesn't interest you, move right along. Invasion of New Capenna. This is a pretty neat card. So, Rite of Oblivion is a card that exists in Standard. It's a white and a black, and can be flashbacked for white, black, and 2 colorless. You sacrifice a permanent to cast it, and it a non-land permanent. And it can exile target non-land permanent. It's a sorcery. So the front side of this card is much like it. You sacrifice an artifact or creature, not any non-land permanent, and it exiles an artifact or creature an opponent controls. Again, not any non-land permanent. Still pretty good removal. Still requires you to sacrifice something to use it. It can be very good. Right? You could lead on the, you know, little 1/1 toxic creature in white. Maybe even attack with it, or not. Just sacrifice it to this, exile something the opponent's put out. It replaces itself with a might. You get the value off the Invasion of New Capenna, and then the might can still help you flip it later into Holy Frazzle Cannon. Holy Frazzle Cannon doesn't have to be in a creature type deck. Whatever it's on, it'll pump that creature. Whatever thing you have that's attacking is going to get a +1 counter every turn. It equips for 1 colorless. That's already a decent piece of equipment on the backside. If there happens to be more than 1 creature out that share a type, it could be even better. But I think at a baseline, as long as you have a creature to put it on and attack, it's good. So I think this could go into a decently wide variety of decks. You just need fodder to sacrifice for it. Invasion of Asgol, this is just a sorcery speed, like, you know, they sack a creature or planeswalker, lose 1 life. It's not amazing. If it was only the front side, it's playable, it's usable. If you only hit a token creature, like, you know, human off a wedding announcement or something, then that's kind of bad. But it also gives you the opportunity to flip it into this battle. And then you get this menace creature that can grow at the beginning of your instep every turn cycle. Overall, I think this is a reasonable card, especially if you expect that you can flip this. I think it's worth experimenting with. Invasion of Ergamon. This makes a treasure, and it lets you discard a card to draw a card. It's kind of splitting the difference with a couple of similar cards where you discard and draw 2. Those cards replace themselves. You don't gain any card advantage, but you get card filtering and you're not down a card. This one puts you down a card, except it ramps you. And that ramp is kind of offsetting, you know, the cost of putting this card out. And then you might be able to turn this card later into a 3/4, and the 3/4 might be able to cycle away a land for you to fetch another battle. Again, that's not card advantage. But if you have a battle deck, and you can make use of all the parts of the buffalo on this card, then I think it's probably going to be pretty decent. I don't know that you can just slap it into any deck. But again, you know, makes you a treasure, put something in your graveyard. If you happen to have a Reanimator deck that starts off red-green, could be pretty good. Or if you got a battle deck. You got a battle deck, this seems like a pretty reasonable inclusion there too. Overall, just a useful tool to have in the toolbox. Botanical Brawler, I have a strong suspicion that this card is actually really good. Don't forget about Proliferate, folks. Proliferate adds counters. And this thing just adds counters whenever you get permanents out that have counters on them. Or add counters to them. It only triggers once for each separate permanent you control, but it triggers for each different one that gets a counter on it. So if you play something like Invasion of Moag, you know, if you've got the Brawler and you've got 2 other creatures, then he'd get 1 counter from the invasion, and then he'd get 2 more counters from your other 2 creatures getting a counter on them. Those would be separate instances that would both trigger. And even if you had not made him any bigger up to that point in the game, which is unlikely, just that sequence, just that play would turn him from a 2/2 into a 5/5. He'd get 3 counters in that exchange, and your other creatures would also be 1 bigger. If those creatures came in with counters, you know, then obviously the Brawler would be even bigger than that. I think this card's actually pretty good. I think we're gonna find some shells for it in Standard that are gonna be pretty nasty. It's just an uncommon. Invasion of New Phyrexia, this one is a mythic. Seems pretty strong though. You can put out X 2/2 white-blue knight tokens with Vigilance, which is not bad. You could play this for 3 mana and get a 2/2 with Vigilance. That's not ideal, but it means it's not a dead card, right? No, it's not card disadvantage exactly. You have board presence starting turn 3. You could play it turn 2 for 0 knights. That is a play that you could make. I don't know why you would, though. You're not very likely to flip something with 6 defense, not getting any creatures out with it. So, reasonable turn 3, reasonable turn 4, starting to look kind of good at 5 mana and beyond. You know, once you get to the point of 5 or more mana when you cast this, it begins to demand a board sweeper a little bit. And you can flip this into Teferi. Not the Teferi that you're used to, he cares about creatures, but still a perfectly serviceable Planeswalker nonetheless. So overall, I just think, you know, since the front side is moderately playable, and it flips into a very valuable backside, this is a pretty good card. Halo Forager. This one's exciting. So, you know, starting at 4 mana, you can get back your cut downs and, you know, your play with fires, your, you know, unsummons. It's not unsummon, you know what I mean. And that's not hard to do. It's not hard at all to have a 1 mana spell in your graveyard and target it with the Halo Forager. It can also steal your opponent's spells. You can't rely on your opponent having spells, but it's a neat trick that it can do. And I watched Strictly Better MTG, Dev from the place. He used this in a deck recently and was pretty often able to get back Invoke Despair from the graveyard with Halo Forager. It's an 8 mana play, but it was happening. He was doing it. I think this card's going to be actually really good. At the very least, I think you can brew around it and it will not disappoint you for constructed. Invasion of Amonkhet is a little bit more risky. It's still just an uncommon here, though. So each player mills 3 cards. The opponent discards 1, you draw 1. So This is card advantage. It replaces itself and your opponent is down a card. It also mills cards into both of your graveyards. You can get value out of it that way. It's not the best for 3 mana. It doesn't impact the board, other than forcing your opponent to play a little differently because they're protecting a battle. On the backside, if you flip it the 4 defense, it turns into Lazotep Convert, which ETBs as a copy of any creature card in a graveyard, but it's a 4/4. So it replaces, you know, the color. Well, okay, it's in addition to the other colors and types, but it does replace the stat line, you know, power and toughness. That means it can be useful to copy a small creature with a nice enter the battlefield trigger. You know, the little doggo draws a card, something like that. You can get a 4/4 and draw a card, that kind of thing. So the neat thing about this ability is that it's pretty good on little utility creatures in early game plays. It's also good on late game plays. It might be smaller. 4/4 might not be as big as the thing you targeted, but a 4/4 Titan of Industry is still a pretty nice play. You know, you can still blow up something of the opponent's, or gain 5 life, or make a 4/4, or get a shield counter. It'll still have trample and reach, it just happens to be a 4/4 instead of a 7/7, and that's probably still worth doing. Or a 4/4 Atraxa, yeah, still pretty good. Still pretty good, as far as I know. This one's more iffy, but it's just an uncommon, so if you want to brew with it, I think it's fine. Stormclaw Rager, so it only sacks stuff at sorcery speed, and that's a serious downside, but it draws cards. It doesn't just get +1 counters, it draws cards. And it's only 1 mana to do each sacrifice. So you can only do it on your turn, you can only do it at sorcery speed, but it's a card draw engine. And that might make this really good. I think it's worth testing out. It's just an uncommon. Elvish Vat Keeper. So it's a 3/3, and it potentially gives you, you know, another 2/2, or potentially another 4/4 if the opponent gives you time and space and mana. And it could do more than that if you have other incubate tokens in the deck, but frankly, I think this card's pretty good value all on its own. You know, I don't know if anyone could have predicted that Corpse Appraiser was going to take over Standard when people first looked at it. It's like, oh, it takes, you know, 1 of every color of 3 different colors of mana to get a 3/3. Is the value proposition really that good? Is there always going to be, you know, fodder in the graveyard to eat? It's like, yeah, can we really run this card or not? People were uncertain, right, when they first saw Corpse Appraiser. I'm not saying Elvish Vat Keeper's necessarily as good as Corpse Appraiser, but it's easier to cast. It affects the board more. I'm just saying. Alright, Zimini and Dina. This is one of the multicolor legends. It's a mythic. It's 3/4 for 3, so, you know, pretty good rate for what you're getting. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you drain the opponent for 2. That's not bad. And then its activated ability draws you a card, which means you can make that drain happen. That's nice too. So you sacrifice another creature, draw a card, you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. That's good. That's a pretty solid ability. You know, the easiest way to get the drain from the first part is to do it on your turn after you've drawn your card for the turn, then you get your second card this way. But if you can draw a card on the opponent's turn, then Zimini and Dina can... Zimone? I'm not sure. Zimone and Dina can drain the opponent on their turn as well, and you can leave it up as a blocker. And if you control 8 or more lands, then this card can drain on their turn on its own because you repeat the process once, which means you sack 1 thing to draw 2 cards and you can put 2 lands onto the battlefield tapped. I can't tell you for sure that this is a good use of your Mythic. I don't think it's bad, though. If you like Sultai, this color combination, or 4 or 5 colors, and you like aristocrats, you like sacrificing creatures, you like card draw engines, you like land drop engines that ramp you into the late game, I think you could do a lot worse than this. A 3, if you can make the mana and get this down on turn 3, it's actually a pretty good roadblock against an aggressive deck. It's a pretty good blocker. It's not very easy to remove a 4 toughness creature. So, it's not a bad proposition of what you're getting at the mana cost you're getting it at. And if the opponent does not get rid of it, then the not just the card draw, but the mana acceleration that this card could represent could let you run away with the game. I think it's pretty neat. Rampaging Geoderm. This is, if you want to make a budget constructed deck that's a battle deck, I think Rampaging Geoderm's like a shoe-in. Because if you're attacking battles, and it doesn't have to be with the Geoderm, it's whenever you attack. Geoderm can sit back at home, you can rush in with some other thing and put a counter on it, or give it +1/+1. It's just a, just an ability of the Geoderm. Doesn't have to affect itself. So, it's just an uncommon. I think there are better options. There's, like the red rare that people have compared to Questing Beast. But this is an uncommon, and it works quite well, I would say, in a budget battle deck. If that's what you want to do. Sorry, budget battle deck made me think of the Butter Battle book by Dr. Seuss. Anyway. I think this is reasonable. I think this is perfectly serviceable. If you want to make that deck, I think this would be a fine craft. Invasion of Moag. I don't know that you would be running 4 copies of this in any constructed deck, but I can imagine a +1 counter deck that actually wants this. It'd be the same kind of deck that would run Botanical Brawler. I'm sure those of you out there who are familiar with the format can probably think of some other things with +1 counters, or that like +1 counters. Right, there's the new white rare. It's a 2/2 with vigilance, and when it gets counters you draw a card. That would be great, of course. Or there's the white soldier that puts counters onto creatures. Also pretty good. There's green cards that like a 2/2 for 2, when you play creature spells, it gets +1 counters, and then if it dies, it sends its counters to another creature. I think there's definitely a potential build for this deck. I don't know if Invasion of Moag makes it in, but it might. It might not be a 4 of. But the deck loves +1 counters so much that this is kind of somewhere between being like an overrun, where you might win the game that turn, and just a great synergy piece, where you can flip it over and get the Bloomwielder Dryads. And they're just one more piece that makes that deck crank along if you get them flipped over. Thalia and the Gitrog monster, you may have already seen this card, may already be excited about it. It is a mythic. So it's 4/4 for 4, Abzan colors, white, black, green. I have fond memories of Abzan from the original Tarkir block. So First Strike, Death Touch, that's already, a pretty amazing grouping of abilities there. Right, a 1/1 First Strike, Death Toucher already trades, well, doesn't trade, just kills anything it tangles with in combat, unless the other thing had First Strike and then it trades. But this one's a 4/4. That makes the clock better. You can play an additional land on each of your turns. I don't know how many people I've seen that are excited about that ability, but that's a big deal to me. That's one of the things I really like about Zimone and Dina, or Zimini. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I think that's a big deal on Thalia and the Gitrog monster. It ramps you. It can ramp you. You can get extra lands out. It's a big deal. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. That that's important. Makes it harder for them to block, makes their haste creatures just turn off. And denying them mana, making all of their non-basics into tap lands, that can be a big deal too. And whenever this attacks, you sacrifice a creature or land which is not a May ability, so you have to pick something. Then you draw a card. So since it always is replacing that sacrifice with a card draw, you probably don't mind that much to sacrifice lands. You always can play an additional land on each of your turns, so... Overall, this card seems really powerful to me. I'm sure it does to most of you as well. You know, you can run it in black-green with the 3/3 Glissa that also has First Strike and Death Touch. It seems kind of ridiculous. And this color combination, white and black have pretty much all the answers you could ever ask for. So you can run an attrition build, you can run an aristocrats deck, you could run a ramp deck. I think there's all kinds of neat archetypes that this can fall right into. The only thing that's restrictive about gold cards is just how many colors they are. But I don't think there's just a type of deck that Thalia and the Gitrog monster can go in. I think there are many types of decks that you could build around it. So I think it's a very worthy consideration. Invasion of Tolvada. This is a 5-mana rare battle. White and black, has 5 defense. When it ETBs, you return a non-battle permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It doesn't have to be a creature. That's interesting. So Invasion of Tolvada can pull back your, Portal to Phyrexia. It can pull back your, let's see, what is it, the blue card? Something about the multiverse. It's 8-mana one where you can cast spells from the top of your library and play one spell for free every turn. So it can reanimate like, a big artifact, a big enchantment. You can get back, a big planeswalker like the new Kaya. You can get different permanent types with this thing, as long as it's not a battle. And that is kind of basically on rate already for 5 mana. Creatures might be the thing you're the most excited to reanimate, but there are some other juicy targets as well. And then you can flip this battle over. It's got 5 defense. When you do, you get the Broken Sky. Your creature tokens get +1/+0 lifelink, and you get a 1/1 flyer at the beginning of your end step every turn. So, it's a little bit of a strange pairing between those two. But the backside's obviously good value. It would be good even on its own with no creature token strategy in the deck whatsoever. It provides for itself. The front side's totally reasonable as your method of reanimation in a reanimation deck. It's much easier to cast than Invoke Justice. Invoke Justice is 4 white pips. This is a white and a black. This is way easier to cast. It doesn't have as much immediate impact, maybe. It doesn't, put out 4/+1 counters. But it has other things going for it. So I think this one is entirely playable. Quite reasonable. Hitsugu and Kairi. People have discovered like a 20 damage combo using this and the junky spell that doesn't quite have Convoke from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It's a 10-mana red spell, deals 10 damage to any target. Can tap creatures to reduce the cost by colorless. This card, in combination with that one, can do 10 off of the reveal and then another 10 by casting it. So that's like a 20 damage combo with this card. This card's pretty good anyway, though. It's a rare 5/4 flyer, blue, and black. So the mana requirements are a little bit stringent. Not too bad. When it ETBs, you brainstorm, which means you draw 3, and then you put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. When it dies, you exile the top card of your library. Target opponent loses life equal to its mana value, and then if it's an instant or sorcery, you can cast it without paying its mana cost. There's some deck building considerations there. You'd really like to have it in a deck that's got, instants and sorceries, and preferably some bigger ones. Maybe you go for like Invoke Despair, maybe you go for Breach the Multiverse, maybe even go for the 20 damage combo. But just, if you even just hit like a removal spell and your opponent has something to be removed, then that's just reasonable value there as well. Overall, this is a perfectly solid card. Good if you can fit it into the right shell. Glissa, Herald of Predation. This is a 3/5 for 5. It's a rare. And beginning of combat, you choose one. So you can play this pre-combat main phase, and if the opponent doesn't instantly kill it, then you'll get one of these effects right away. You can incubate 2 twice. So you can get 2 little incubator tokens that aren't creatures yet. Or you can transform all of your incubator tokens. Or Phyrexians you control gain First Strike and Death Touch till end of turn. Since that only triggers at combat on your turn, that means it's offensive First Strike and Death Touch, and only for Phyrexians, which all the incubator tokens turn into Phyrexians. I think the value on this card is pretty stellar. There's only so many 5-drops that you can run in a deck. Based on what colors you're in, you might decide something else is better, but just, getting this down and doing an Incubate 2 twice, that's great insurance against any sweeper that's not like Farewell. Other than Farewell, getting those incubators is going to be a big pain for a control opponent. If you're up against like aggro or mid-range, 5-drops are not what you want necessarily against aggro. If you've lived to the point in the game to get Glissa down, 5 toughness is a nice stabilizing presence on the battlefield. If you have any existing incubators that can give you more blockers, that would be nice. Against a mid-range deck, again, you probably want the incubate twice. You want to pile up value against a mid-range deck. It's kind of a battle of attrition. But, so I'm saying Glissa's pretty good on her own, and you could build an incubator deck where as soon as you hit 5, she comes down and transforms all of them for you. And if you've got a bunch of, incubate 4s, incubate 5s, things that have a lot of counters on them, it could be a very sudden, abrupt, aggressive attack that came on turn 5. In that particular deck. But I think Glissa does pretty good work just in general. Not a bad use of a rare, I would say. Quintorius. Quintorius looks really good. So he's a 3/5 for 5, he's got Vigilance. Beginning of your end step. So again, you play him like post-combat main phase. If the opponent doesn't kill him right away, you can exile a non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard. So, yeah, that's most of the card types. Just can't be creature or land. And you create a 3/2 red-white spirit creature token. So if you get that to happen, you've already got 6 power and 7 toughness on 2 bodies, which is not bad for 5 mana. Got Vigilance. But then he's got the ability of pay a white, a red, and 1, tap, sacrifice a spirit. Choose a card exiled with Quintorius, and you may cast it without paying its mana cost, and then if it would be put in a graveyard, it goes on the bottom of its owner's library instead. which will be your library because it came out of your graveyard. Anyway. So this means that Quintorius, could sacrifice spirits to recast a lot of things. You could be recasting Invoke Despairs. You could be recasting Breach the Multiverse. You can be recasting Planeswalkers. The Wandering Emperor, or the big one, the Eternal Wanderer at 6 mana. You could be casting Itali. No, not Itali because he's a creature. Right, but without paying its mana cost. Right, so this could even be like Portal to Phyrexia, for example. You don't pay its mana cost, you just sack a spirit. And Quintorius will continue to generate 3/2 spirits at the end of your turn, as long as he stays on the battlefield. So, if you keep a supply of cards in your graveyard, which is not hard to do, he's a creature factory, he's reanimating things out of your graveyard, as long as it's not a creature or a land, and they're filtering back onto the bottom of your library for like really long game value. Quintorius is weird, like a little clunky, but I think there's definitely multiple types of decks you could build around Quintorius. And there might be some types of decks you could just kind of drop into. Pretty reasonable. Get a 3/5 with Vigilance, get a 3/2 Spirit. Maybe get additional upside. Alright, Borborygmos and Fibblethip. That's a mouthful. It's a Mythic. This is green, blue, red, and 2 colorless for a 6/5. I think this color combination is called Teamer. Cyclops Homunculus. Whenever it ETBs or attacks, you draw a card, then you can discard lands. And it deals twice that much damage to target creature, right? So 1 land would be 2 damage, 2 lands would be 4 damage, etc. And you draw a card first, so you're more likely to be able to use the trigger. And even if you're not discarding any lands, even if the opponent has no creatures to target, you're drawing cards. Draws a card when it comes in, draws a card when it attacks. Reasonable. And you can pay a blue and a colorless, and you can put this into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So it needs to be on the battlefield to have that activated ability. So if you get this out, it can protect itself, sort of, with 2 mana. Where it just goes back into your library, a couple turns later you get it, you draw another card, the value train happens all over again. I don't normally think of this color combination as like a control deck, but this would be a good control deck finisher. You could use it in this color combination. You can also use it in a 4 or 5 color control deck. That seems more likely. As long as you keep the mana open, I think this card is a pretty good way to ensure that you end the game at some point. Speaking of control deck finishers, Zurgo and Ojutai is a blue, red, white, and 2. I believe that's Jeskai. It's a 4/4 Mythic Orc Dragon. It's flying in haste, hexproof as long as it entered the battlefield this turn. And whenever 1 or more dragons you control, including itself, deals combat damage to a player or battle, look at the top 3, put 1 in your hand, rest on the bottom in any order, and you can return one of those dragons to its owner's hand. So the reason you would do that is because this can bounce back, and as long as the opponent can't counterspell you, they'll come back down with Flying Haste and Hexproof again. There are some types of decks that would have a great deal of trouble with that. You know, if they have counterspells, then you might not want to bounce it back to your hand if you manage to get it into play. There are other decks, though, that are more, removal heavy, that couldn't interact with this card hardly at all. It's interesting. Definitely interesting. And it can keep chipping in damage, drawing you the best card out of your top 3. Could also work in a Dragon Tribal deck, but just works pretty well on its own. Invasion of Lorwyn, I think this is a cool budget option here. So, it's a battle. It's got green, black, 4 colorless, and 5 defense. When it ETBs, you destroy a non-elf creature. It's not too much of a targeting restriction. An opponent controls with power X or less, where X is the number of lands you control. There will be occasions where maybe you've ramped and you haven't ramped with lands. You could cast this for 6, but you only have 4 or 5 mana, and the opponent has done something funky to go tall with their creatures, and the power is too high, and this won't kill it. Or maybe on rare occasion, it's an elf. Generally, it's going to kill whatever you point it at. 6 is usually more than you want to pay for this effect, but if you're in a long attrition kind of a deck, and you're doing like a budget build, I think this could be pretty reasonable, because if you flip this on the backside, you get a creature with power and toughness equals the number of lands you control. It's a threat that the opponent has to respect. If they can keep making chump blockers, that's fine, but more likely it's going to either win you the game or eat a removal spell from the opponent, or trade with, a Sheoldred or something. Overall, you get a really decent kill spell on the front. It's overcosted, right? It's too expensive. It's at sorcery speed. But it kills pretty much anything in standard that you want to point it at. And on the backside, you have a really compelling board presence. And in the meantime, getting a battle down can change the way your opponent decides to play. Maybe you can't pressure their life total enough, but you could pressure the invasion of Lorwyn. And now they have to think about blocking for it, or whether they can deal with your winnowing forces. Since it's an uncommon, I feel, less pressure on trying to sell you that this card is good. It might not be, but anything that's a common or uncommon is like a budget option. So I think it's not going to be hard to experiment with it. And that brings us to Kogla and Yadaro. So red, red, green, green is pretty steep mana requirements, also 2 colorless. It's a rare 7/7 ape dinosaur turtle. I love turtles. When this ETBs, you choose one. It can either gain trample and haste. That's totally reasonable. Might kill a planeswalker. Might kill your opponent. Or it can fight a creature you don't control. Could trade with a Sheoldred. Could just outright kill most other things. Also trades with things, like Glissa and Thalia and the Gitrog monster, things like that. With, First Strike and Death Touch. Fight doesn't care about First Strike. But that's not the only mode on this card. When it's in your hand, you can pay a green, a red, and 2 and discard it. Destroy an artifact or enchantment. And those are everywhere in the format right now. So you're probably going to find targets for that. You shuffle this into your library from your graveyard and draw a card. So, as an artifact enchantment removal spell, it's a little overcosted, but it's at instant speed, can't be countered unless they can counter an ability and not a spell. And it replaces itself. So you actually gain card advantage in that exchange, right? You spend a card to blow up something on the opponent's side of the battlefield, but then it replaces itself. So you've actually 2-for-1'd the opponent in that exchange. The fight can also 2-for-1 the opponent as long as this card lives. Now they have to deal with it. There's a lot of value baked into this card. I think it's actually really strong. And that brings me to what I'm going to be crafting here. So I've got 6 rares, 3 mythics, 8 uncommons right now to throw at this. I need to do some trimming, so hold on. Okay, this list here I'm going to go ahead and hit the craft button on. I cut Zergo and Ojutai not because I think it's like the weakest card or whatever, it's the one I'm the least interested in building with. That's the other thing you need to recognize in yourself as a brewer, a deck designer. You cannot just craft the strongest cards in the format because they are the strongest cards in the format and everyone plays them, if it's going to make you unhappy. You need to know yourself. You know, you could craft, 4 Sheoldreds and 4 Fable of the Mirror Breakers and stuff like that, and you'll end up with a good deck. But if it's not where your heart's at, if it's not what excites you about the game, if it's not the play pattern that you want to see, and it's not giving you the tools in your toolbox that you want to build a wide variety of decks, to be honest, Fable of the Mirror Breaker does actually fit into a wide variety of decks. It's annoying. It's irksome. Sheoldred's quite good too. If you can't like prioritize what she does, then she's just kind of generically randomly good. But if it's not where your heart's at, if it's not what gets you excited to jump into the game and play Magic, if you feel icky about crafting those cards and you feel unhappy about playing that deck, then don't do it. Don't craft that card. Craft the cards you find interesting and want to try out. That's what I'm doing. 7 uncommons, 5 rares, 3 mythics. Bam. Alright. I'm feeling pretty happy about where my collection is sitting on this account now. Just burned up all my mythics. I'm happy. Now hopefully I've brought you some value in revisiting this series for March of the Machine. So like, subscribe, do the YouTube stuff, and until next time, stay cool.